Now to more on my investigation into the shocking censorship of pro-Jewish and Israel content at SBS. The taxpayer-funded broadcaster refused to publish or remove from online or edited interviews that they thought were too supportive of Israel. One was with a family member of a current hostage being held in Gaza. That interview was completed, but it never went to air. It is beyond shocking. Imagine silencing the family member of a current hostage. And that family member, by the way, is going to come on my show on Monday night and speak about this. There needs to be a federal government investigation into what has gone on here. In another example, an internationally renowned activist fighting anti-Semitism, she had her interview edited. Then another interview with Richard Kemp. It was initially broadcast on SBS radio, then it was deleted completely from all SBS platforms just a few hours later. And he's going to join me live right now. The Jewish journalist who did those interviews, Amit Rihak, is now seeking legal advice. But it shouldn't be up to him. It needs to be up to all of us to hold this taxpayer-funded broadcaster to account. Meanwhile, Israel has uncovered evidence that 6 Al Jazeera journalists are terrorist operatives from Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. One of the journalists is said to have served as the head of a rocket launching squad. I mean, listen to that. One of the Al Jazeera journalists served as the head of a rocket launching squad. Another was said to be the deputy of a propaganda unit in Islamic Jihad. One was a sniper. Another was a training company commander who was then wounded in an Israeli airstrike. These terrorists weren't bringing you the news. They were bringing you propaganda straight from terror organisations. Yet the mainstream media lapped it up because they were hungry to accuse Israel of war crimes. And when Israel has killed terrorists, media outlets have complained that journalists were being targeted. I asked SBS today whether they would now be cutting ties with Al Jazeera. No response to these questions. Well, to discuss all of this, let's bring in now, live from Israel, retired British Commander Richard Kemp. Colonel, thank you very much for joining me. Now, you've led British forces into Iraq and Afghanistan. Your views, anyone would argue, deserve to be heard. What is your reaction to my revelation that the SBS deleted an interview with you because you were too supportive of Israel?
Well, unfortunately, it's the reality of so many large-scale and influential broadcasters and other media outlets as well, that they want to bias their output against Israel. It's not a question of just deleting people who are speaking in support of Israel or in support of the truth and reality, but also they want that their primary emphasis is on anti-Israel bias. And people like SBS, the BBC over here in the UK, and other broadcasting organisations, they basically fuel Hamas. They encourage Hamas. They give strength to Hamas. They prolong the conflict, and it's all by supporting Hamas's narrative, whether wittingly or unwittingly. That's what they do, and it's the same with organisations like the United Nations and the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court. They're all strengthening Hamas. They might as well be part of Hamas with the bias that they show towards Hamas and against Israel.
I understand a scenario where, say, Vladimir Putin was being interviewed, and so the interviewer was required to ask very tough questions. But Israel is an ally of Australia, of America, of the United States. So can you understand this scenario where you, as a former British commander, a distinguished war veteran, where you're not allowed to express your viewpoint on a public broadcaster in Australia because you were too supportive of one of our allies?
Yeah, I can understand it. I disagree with it, of course, but I was actually asked some quite tough questions during the SBS interview, and quite rightly too. They're entitled and they should probe people's views, whatever their background, whoever they are. But if they do want their listeners to have a balanced perspective of Israel, and of the conflict there and of the different mechanics there, then they need to include people like me. And I don't demand a right to have a platform. They invited me to be interviewed in the first place. I didn't ask for it, but I've got objective experience. I'm not Israeli. I'm not Jewish. I have a great deal of experience of armed conflict around the world. I've been in Israel for most of the last year. I've been into Gaza with the IDF. I've seen the reality of what's happening. I've studied Hamas in great depth. And I think my perspective, with modesty, I think my perspective is probably worth hearing, which I assume is the reason they asked for me to join in the first place, although they obviously didn't like what they heard.
Very good point, and apologies. I thought you were still in Israel because when I was there a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed you on the ground, but you're now back in London. Just before we move on to other topics, given SBS is a publicly funded broadcaster, do you think there should be an investigation into the extent of this censorship of pro-Israel voices?
Yeah, I do. I think if any organisation, any media organisation is funded by taxpayers' money, the taxpayer should have an objective, or that the media organisation should be speaking objectively. They shouldn't be censoring people who just don't happen to suit their private agenda. And the same applies, as I mentioned, to organisations like the BBC. There have been numerous investigations into the BBC finding horrific anti-Israel bias over many years. And what's the result? Zero. There's investigations. There's not public or formal investigations yet. There should be. But all of the investigations showed this bias, and the BBC simply brush it aside. And I'm sure SBS will do the same.
Yeah. I want to ask you about this FBI investigation into the leaking of at least 2 classified documents to social media. This detailed Israel's preparations for a potential strike on Iran in retaliation for the ballistic missiles a couple of weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago now. Richard, how concerning is this leak of classified material? It looks, we don't know for certain, it looks like it has come from the US end.
Yeah, I think it's deeply concerning, and it does show, I think it shows either a desire among certain individuals within the US government organizations to do damage to Israel, either that or gross misjudgment about what is the right thing in relation to trying to what, as they continually discuss it, de-escalate the situation. But it goes beyond that kind of misjudgment and the direct damage of this leak, which is certainly going to be damaging. Israel provides a huge amount of intelligence to the United States, as it does to Australia and the UK and other countries, in relation to threats to our countries. And, when I was in Australia a few years back, it came to light that there was a terrorist plan, an Al-Qaeda plan, I think, to hijack an aircraft from Sydney Airport and crash it. And that was stopped by Israeli intelligence. So if there's damage to the intelligence relationship through leakage, then of course that puts in jeopardy the continued flow of intelligence from Israel. I don't think actually Israel would ever, no matter what any country does to it, would ever deny intelligence, life-saving intelligence to any country, but it's potentially very damaging.
Look, we have been expecting Israel to retaliate against those Iranian strikes for a couple of weeks now. It still hasn't happened. Is your sense that Israel was waiting for this US THAAD missile defence system to be up and running, or do you think there's a possibility, and I think it was that they were waiting for the THAAD missile defence system to be up and running before they launched an attack on Iran, but do you think there is a possibility that they could be waiting until after the US election?
I think all of those things and other factors come into play here, and Prime Minister Netanyahu is the person who will make the ultimate decision with the authority of the Security Cabinet on exactly when and what action to take. I think Israel knows what it's going to do. But all of these different factors, like making sure there is enough defense in Israel against a potential large-scale Iranian retaliation, does come into play, as of course does the US election. And Israel has been extremely effective so far in this war. To some extent, that is due to US support with weaponry, etc., as well as defense systems. And of course, it's therefore important that Israel doesn't do anything to seriously undermine its relationship with the US, particularly at this critical point before an election. I think they may have greater freedom to act when they see the outcome of the election. So potentially it'll be after that. But I wouldn't, nor would I discount it happening at any time. All these there's so many different factors involved, which we know about, but the Israeli Prime Minister does. And as far as I can see so far, he's been calling all the right shots in this war.
Yep, couldn't agree with you more. All right, Colonel Richard Kemp, really appreciate your time tonight. Thank you.